Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is your first day of the course this semester. Welcome again. You know, we're doing this under online circumstances, which is not ideal, but we can make this work. Mostly what I'm going to do for this particular video is talk about your syllabus and expectations for the course in general. Now, normally this would be a 30 to 45 minute part of an in-person version of this course where I would ask you to read a syllabus, go over different details that I think are important to remember around the syllabus, and talk about your assignments and so on and so forth. I'm going to try to do a condensed version of that in basically 10 or 15 minutes. So, the main thing, there are several main themes. First of all, that this course is not about monuments. It's not about West Potomac Park and Lincoln Memorial. It's not about the reflecting pool or the Smithsonian institutions. It's not about the Grant Memorial outside the U.S. Capitol building or the White House to the north of the National Mall. That's all part of D.C. But that's not what D.C. is. D.C. is a city with living, breathing human beings, generations of whom have lived here and lived in and around this area, and their ancestors and their lives and their deaths and the cultures that they brought to the city and the influences they've had on its development over the years. So that involves things like race and class and gender and sexual orientation and geography and how those intersect and the development and evolution of Washington, D.C. and the DMV, the Chesapeake Bay region that includes the states of Maryland, Virginia, and maybe even parts of Delaware, since basically the late 18th century. Where first we kind of predate some of that, but the truth of the matter is this is about culture, the history of an area known as the DMV, the Greater Washington, D.C. area, and of course central to that, Washington, D.C. itself. It's both the nation's capital and as a local actual city, and how this city evolves over time from a sleepy little town to a small city to a metropolitan city to a cosmopolitan city, and that this city that we think has always been the seat of pure, unadulterated superpower status was mostly not that until after World War II, and mostly not what we think of as cosmopolitan really until the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And even then, cosmopolitan in what sense? So that's what we're talking about here in terms of this course this semester in a nutshell. And that's the expectation for this course. That's how I'm teaching this course. The first 4 or 5 weeks of this course are basically the history of the city from roughly its origins in the early 17th century and its evolution from an area that was once primarily consisted of Native American groups to an area that's dominated by slavery, a very black and very white city, in terms of that very Anglo-American. Gradually, over time, becomes a city that has a large number of African Americans in it. Um, Gradually becomes a city that's mostly black, even as the city is going through Jim Crow segregation, and eventually becomes a city that is a world power, that's part of the U.S. as a world power, and then a major superpower, right? That's in a nutshell the whole history up into Home Rule, and Marion Barry's rule as mayor for most of the 70s, for the 80s and 90s, starting in the 70s. Then we'll get into culture and cultural issues around education, around gentrification, around housing, around local protests and the politics of that, around music, around the LGBTQIA community in DC, women's rights, DC is a national site, those sorts of things, those different topics. And so that's the course in a nutshell. But with that comes assignments, with that comes expectations. And the format that I've used for this course, this is the third semester I've used this format for this course, and I've been teaching this particular version of the course 4 semesters. I taught social history, Washington, D.C., and my other institution, which is University of Maryland Global Campus, formerly known as University of Maryland, University College, way back when I started there in 2008. And that course primarily revolved around the history of DC and not the evolution of culture in DC. And so what's different about this particular format is that it's project based. And so while you're building on certain themes around reading of books and writing papers and writing reflections, about 40% of this course is about you going out into the community, in this case virtually, to learn more about a particular topic of interest for you, or maybe for you and one other person as part of a group, to do research on, and do a presentation on, and do an executive summary of around an issue or a problem or a theme for others to learn from within the course. So everything in this course is designed so that by the time you start working on this project, working on this type of, let's do this presentation on X or Y or Z, that you have enough background around the history and evolution of the DC culturally and otherwise to be able to do such a thing. So you're doing 4 reflections. For the course I've taught over the last year, it's been 6 or it's been 10. I don't see the point of belaboring you with more and more reflections. These reflections are really to help you think about where you are at different stages in this course in terms of what you know, what you've learned, what's been eye-opening, what's been depressing, that sort of thing. So they're personal reflections, but their personal reflections aren't just purely based on your opinion. I mean, there are people who write all kinds of things in these things that I'm not going to share specifically, but show a lack of knowledge, right? So you want to play up your ignorance, but you also want to play up what you've learned too. You don't want to just spout opinions that aren't based on anything, but are based on something you've actually learned. You know, from the readings, from watching videos, from the lecture notes, from whatever. The first one is due basically, I think it's due week 3, and that's really you reflecting on what you didn't know when you started the course and what opened your eyes in the first couple of weeks. You'll have another one around, you have 2 more right around the middle of the course to sort of reflect back on what you've learned. I think one's week 7, another one's week 10, somewhere in there in the middle of the course. And then you'll have an end reflection in the course to talk about what you have, what the course has done for you in terms of what you've learned over the course of 15 or 16 weeks. So there's that. There's also discussions. We're doing Zoom discussions. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll just, I realize everyone has their different takes on how we're going to do Zoom, how we're going to do this virtually. So if you are not comfortable with speaking, it's okay, right? Send me your questions, send me your commentary ahead of class, email me, let me know that you are still engaged, and I will count that as credit towards your discussion grade. If you give me something to work with so that I can ask your question on your behalf, or so that I can make a comment for you on your behalf, it will help you earn that 20% of your discussion grade and do well on it. So please do that. Don't just come in week after week, have a blank screen so that I can't see you, say nothing, and then don't give me anything to work with either. Give me something. Send me an email. Say, Professor Collins, I have this question. I don't understand this about the readings. Or Professor Collins, I have this comment. I don't feel comfortable giving it myself, but if you could use your voice to voice my comment so that people can discuss it, that would be great. So please do that. I'm encouraging you to do that early on. As you well know, we are meeting at our normal time, but only for an hour at a time per week to have discussions. This is not time for lectures. That's what my lecture videos are for. That's what the lecture notes are for. Between the two, you have plenty. You actually probably have more to work with than you would if I were just delivering a lecture every week. So it's probably a good thing in some respects. As far as you have 2 papers due. You have 1 paper, I believe, that is due week 6. Let me take a quick look at the schedule. Yeah, that sounds about right. Week 6, and then one due week 11 or so. And they're both on books. One's on the topic of Training Day for Negro Girls, which is supposed to be a fiction novel that's a composite of a variety of different essays, a variety of different walks of life of black women who live in the nation's capital and live in and around the nation's capital, and their experiences on the basis of race, class, gender, and geography. In other words, intersectionality, for those of you who are familiar with the term intersectionality. And we don't get to talk very often about the specific life chances and circumstances of particular groups in this town. Um, we might talk about whites in general, we might talk about blacks in general, but we specifically do not talk about black women. We don't talk about black girls and what their experiences are living in this town, and living in this town, particularly the period after Marion Barry becomes mayor and the town gains home rule in the mid to late 1970s. Right, so the period roughly 1974 to roughly 2015 or so is covered in this novel. So, Camille Acker's book, even though it's a novel, is based a lot on a composite of different experiences that black women have had in this town. Good book to read. The other one that you have is Black Food Geographies, which deals with gentrification and food geography and access for blacks and for whites, and for, to some extent, even for Latinx folks who live in the district, and how that's evolved over time, particularly in Northeast Washington for the area known as Deanwood, but could be applied just as easily towards 7 and 8 in Southeast Washington, including, of course, Anacostia and Congress Heights and places along those lines. And the contrast between that and, you know, Tinleytown and other parts of Northwest DC, where there seems to be a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's on every block, where there's no lack of public services per se relative to Ward 6, 7, and 8, where Deanwood's located, where Congress Heights is located, where Anacostia and other parts of DC are located. So it's a really so Ashante Reese's book is very good for that, and those are your two paper assignments. But those are really just there to help you gain knowledge as you and background as you are working on this major project that you're doing, either as an individual student or paired with one other student if you decide that you want to do it as a group. So I'm going to encourage you to try to get to know each other through the introduction process online and discussions in Blackboard, as well as some small group work that we'll try to incorporate later on into the semester, like say weeks 4, 5, and 6, so that by week 6 you can decide, week 5 or 6 you can decide, hey, I want to work with this person on gentrification in Shaw, or I want to work with this person to look at the development of the Purple Line in Maryland, or I want to look at this person to look at how effective the DC response has been to coronavirus in the period since March of 2020, or whatever the topic happens to be. The syllabus goes over all of that in a lot of detail. So I just wanted to work that out. By the way, this course, while it's mostly taught in the traditional manner in terms of grading, I will not be grading your project assignments per se, meaning that I will give you feedback, qualitative feedback to help you try to improve it, but you will not get a final grade on it until after you have done your second draft and put together your video presentation for it. Again, the syllabus goes over this in a lot more detail. I'll talk a lot more about this um, as the semester progresses. Just a final word around expectations. We're going to be playing this by ear, but you're going to have to be self-disciplined and self-motivated throughout. This is not the time to fall behind for 2 or 3 weeks and then check back in and go, oh, professor, I'm back, help me out, whatever. I mean, the fact of the matter is I can be flexible with deadlines, and I plan on being flexible with deadlines. I can be flexible in terms of how I grade, and I'm going to be flexible with how I grade because of the nature of what we're doing. But at the same time, you need to be checked in. You need to be focused. And if you start falling behind after 2 or 3 weeks, that's a lot to try to make up for. And even all the flexibility I can practice on my end can't make up for the fact that you lost 3 or 4 weeks into the course, in the course. So please try to be self-motivated, self-disciplined, and manage your time as well as you possibly can. This is a marathon, as they say, and not a sprint. So, but if you fall too far behind, you know, all the sprinting in the world isn't going to help you catch up. So please don't. All right, let's get started. Love to see you all in the next few days.